I think she's a disgrace. I actually don't think she's a talented person. I've tried to be nice to her because I would have liked to have gotten some deals done. She's incapable of doing deals. She's a nasty, vindictive, horrible person. And ask Nancy, why is her district drug needles all over the place? It's the most disgusting thing, what she's allowed to happen to her district, with needles, with drug addicts, with people living in the middle of the streets, with people living on the sidewalk. You can't go. She ought to focus on that because she's a disaster. And she made a statement. It was a horrible,
when you were
nasty,
overseas,
vicious statement while I'm overseas. Now, if I made any statement about anybody, it would be like a big head. Why would he do that when he's overseas? She did it when she is a terrible person. And I'll tell you, her name, it's Nervous Nancy, because she's a nervous wreck.
And there was more in that interview with Fox News at the American Military Cemetary in Normandy, with the backdrop of rows of headstones of U.S. servicemen killed during the liberation of France 75 years ago.
They thought their good friend Bobby Mueller was going to give them a great report, and he came out with a report with 13 horrible, angry Democrats who were totally biased against me.
Do you mind if he testifies still? Before you said you didn't care. Mueller testified.
Let me tell you. He made such a fool out of himself the last time because what people don't report is the letter he had to do to straighten out his testimony, because his testimony was wrong. But Nancy Pelosi, I call her Nervous Nancy, Nancy Pelosi doesn't talk about it. Nancy Pelosi's a disaster, okay? She's a disaster. I will tell you, the more successful we become, the more angry people like Nancy Pelosi, who don't have what it takes. The opponent, who shouldn't have even been allowed to run, you know, she happens to be a crooked person, so her name was very appropriate. We have crying Chuck Schumer, who's a disaster, by the way. He's a total political, jerk.
Jeremy Bash, there's a pretty easy way to handle those questions with those headstones behind you, and that I'm not going to talk about that here, not now. When we get back home, there'll be plenty of time for politics, but today is about the men who served and lay behind me.
Totally undignified. Actually, I think it besmirches the honor and dignity of the moment, of that place, of the occasion of remembering what happened 75 years ago. And the thing about the president's speech, Willie, is as much as we appreciate the words, the thing that I thought when I heard it was that it's a total repudiation of the Trump foreign policy. Right. The Trump foreign policy has been to enable and embolden autocrats, tyrants, the populist, neo-nationalist movements sweeping Europe. And in fact, D-Day, I think, in some ways commemorates the exact opposite, which is the unification of the United States, our transatlantic allies, to push back against tyranny and to stand up for freedom.
And then, Caddy, there's the substance of what the president said, which is totally made up and doesn't make any sense. He talked about Robert Mueller, again, the Purple Heart and Bronze Star awardee. He said that Mueller had to put out a letter to straighten out his testimony. There was no testimony from, maybe he was talking about the Mueller report himself, but the president also was making things up as he talked in front of those headstones.
Yeah, well, maybe he was referring to Bob Mueller's statement before the cameras. Look, the overwhelming impression of that interview is the setting of it, right? It's less what the president said, although it was very vitriolic against a whole huge range of people: Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, Hillary Clinton, Bob Mueller. He took on all of his favorites. But you wonder whether somebody in the White House this morning is not looking at the image. Turn the television onto mute, and he's not looking at the image and thinking, wow, maybe we shouldn't have injected domestic politics in the tone in which the president did it in that particular setting. Because for me, having visited those graves all through my childhood, it is a jarring image seeing the President of the United States, who in one breath is talking about the fact that we are bound together as nations, as allies fighting a common cause, and we always will be. And then to hear him talk in this way about fellow American politicians is really striking. And I think it was, Steve was saying, it's not a dignified setting for the president to be talking about that.
Willie, unfortunately, Caddy, I wish it was the case that there was somebody in the White House looking at that and saying, boy, you shouldn't have done that. The sad part is there's no one in the White House. And he's despicable. We sit there and we just comment on it, calling Chuck Schumer a jerk, calling Nancy a horrible human being because she disagrees with him. to your point, Steve, we can't normalize this. He's despicable. That is despicable play of humanity that if anybody sixth grader behaved that way, they would be sent to their room. He is a despicable human being.
Well, the thing is, the White House didn't just look the other way. They must have set this up. They arrange all the interviews. Trump doesn't arrange his own interviews. They arrange the interviews and they arrange the backdrop. So the timing and the setting for this was decided by the White House.
Sure, but